accredited workplace mediator, I want to share with you the top 3 reasons I see people coming into conflict in the workplace. Now, when people come into mediation with me, they typically say to me, I just want good communication, to be respected, and to just get on with my job and for them to get on with theirs. It's just common sense. Now, here's the thing, common sense is not so common, and research shows that people often can't define what they believe is common sense, or they come into conflict with what that is and what the interpretation of that is. It all comes down to how we interpret that information. What does professional communication mean? What does respect look like? And how do we know who is doing what and the distribution of work? So let's have a look at professional communication and what does that mean? I want to share with you a story of a mediation that I did in which 2 people were in conflict about their interpretation of professional communication. One was a field worker who was often out on site doing the work, and the other was a team leader and manager of a group of people. The field worker felt like they were being micromanaged and they felt like their manager was incompetent. Their manager was constantly phoning them when they were out on site, checking up on them, interrupting on what they were doing, and the phone calls were incessant. All they wanted to do was chit-chat and they never got on with their work. The field worker was constantly emailing information to their manager, detailing what they were doing and documenting things and not getting a response. They were putting all their information onto the data system and updating that on their work and still not getting feedback from their manager, but getting incessant phone calls, and it was driving them nuts. The manager, on the other hand, felt that they had absolutely no connection with this team worker. They felt they had a good rapport with all their team and was able to check in, touch base, ask them how they were going. They really valued the toolbox meetings and the group meetings where they were able to check in with their teammates, see how they were going, and having those general conversations just to touch base. And they felt whenever they went to the group of workers that this difficult field worker would turn their back and not engage in conversation. They just felt they weren't in touch with what they were doing, where they were going, how they were doing their work, and when they would try to call them to find out where they were and what they were doing, they were getting no response. They were being completely ignored. Each person had an interpretation of what they felt professional communication was. The field worker felt that email communication and email communication alone was all that was required for professional communication. On the other hand, the team leader felt that verbal communication was the only way to go, that emails were just getting in the way. They really wanted to be able to just chat, talk, and touch base with the team to get a feel of what they were doing. Both was extreme in their version of professional communication. Reality is, they probably needed a mix of both. So what each party agreed to do was meet halfway. The emailer agreed to email a little less and speak a little more. The speaker agreed to not hound and phone and chat all the time, speak a little less, and email and respond through email a little more. So finding a common ground around communication style can be really important. Finding a way to communicate with the other person how they like to communicate is really, really valuable. Now, when it comes to respect in the workplace, respect is another one of those things that can be open to interpretation. You need only look at the plethora of videos on social media where people are incensed at what somebody else is doing within their space, whether it be in a public park or in the workplace or on the phone. they feel that they are being disrespected. We also know how easily it is to be incensed or offended by something else that someone else is doing from another culture. So it's okay in our culture, but not okay in theirs, or vice versa. It's very easy to misinterpret what is appropriate communication. For example, there can be situations in a workplace where someone is making light banter about something in an attempt to create rapport and friendship with colleagues, but it could be a little culturally offensive for that person. So if you are the person who is in that offended situation, it's important that you communicate that you find it uncomfortable when people make jokes or reference about those particular things or address you in a particular way, but also communicate why you find that offensive. I want to share with you another case study where two colleagues found that the other was being disrespectful. We had one worker who was very socially engaging and liked to build rapport with their colleagues. They often spent time chatting with their colleagues, getting to know them, finding out what they've done on the weekend and building rapport. The manager was a very hard worker, very dedicated and very committed to their work. Now, what was happening was the manager would enter the workspace each day. They would walk directly to their office, barely acknowledging their team. And the chatty team member was really offended that they were not even being acknowledged. Now, the manager believed that there was no time for idle chit-chat, that it was disrespectful to spend so much time just standing around chatting. Once again, we can see that there's value in finding a common ground. It's important to build rapport and get to know the personal side of the colleagues that you're working with, but we can also overextend in that area as well. So coming into work each morning, it's useful to acknowledge and recognize your colleagues and validate that they are there and part of the team. So the compromise that these two workers were able to make in terms of how they showed respect to each other was the team manager would make a point to acknowledge everybody and have a brief conversation before heading into their office and starting the work day. And the other colleague agreed to minimise the chat times to specific break times throughout the day and limiting the conversation to those periods of time. So morning tea breaks and an afternoon tea break where they could sit and have a coffee and chat for a restricted period of time. The third thing that I see, the other thing that I see with workplace conflicts is the distribution of work. When people come into conflict, it is often because there is a known procedure but not a formalised one. There's an understanding of who owns what within the workplace and who owns responsibility. Some people feel that work needs to be done a certain way, and others may feel it needs to be done a different way. Who owns that work and who doesn't? And often it's the distribution of work that can come into conflict but is never actually discussed. Having clear procedures, not only about who owns the task and at what point, but also the timing around that, when it should be done, what kind of time frame is needed in order to have that task completed. So having good communication that is effective for both parties, determining what respect means for each people, and having a clear outline of whose work is within what scope will help alleviate some of those tensions in the workplace that can result in conflict.